as Richard... The Ancestral Trail, Book 8, Enlil's Dungeon. First published by Marshall Cavendish, 1993. Based on a story by Frank Graves. No easy solution suggested itself, as Richard peered into the huge rip that ran deep into the mountain, slicing through the tunnel like a knife. The trio could neither cross nor go back. There must be a way, Richard thought in despair. His eyes lit on Melek's rope. Then he gazed across the chasm. The line of oily torches continued on the other side of the gap. "If you tie Melek's rope to an arrow and fire it over that metal clamp," Richard said to Orcan after a moment's thought, "you could get across while we hold the rope. Melek can follow, and I'll swing across." Orcan's eyes narrowed as he calculated the odds. Without a word, he unslung his bow and tied one end of the rope to an arrow. He took a deep breath and fired. The arrow soared over the chasm and lodged in a bracket. Richard, who was holding the other end of the rope, gave a hard tug, and it held firm. Orcan made his way along the rope, while Richard and Melek held it taut. Melek quickly followed. Then, safe on the other side, they urged Richard on. "Hang on tight, and don't look down," Orcan called. This was the moment Richard had been dreading. He would have to swing to the other side and somehow stop himself from crashing hard into the wall. Looking down, he saw that his knuckles had gone white with the ferocity of his grip. A raucous clamour from behind brought Richard's head up with a jerk. Zoc and his men had appeared and were almost upon him. He swallowed nervously, crammed his torch into his pocket, and stepped into space. One moment Richard was dropping into the black chasm, the next his feet struck solid rock on the other side. He took a deep breath and began to scramble up the rope. At the same time, on the ledge above, Orcan and Melek hauled as hard as they could and watched Zoc's men anxiously. As Richard climbed, a spear whizzed off the rock by his face. He redoubled his efforts, feeling the skin scrape away from his knees and knuckles as he scrambled, half climbing, half pulled up the wall of the abyss. Then there was a sudden lurch. "What's happening?" Richard called up. "The bracket's going!" Orcan yelled back. The bracket, with rope attached, was working loose from its moorings. Orcan managed to get a better grip on the rope and urged Melek to pull harder and Richard to climb faster. More clubs and knives landed at their feet as Richard clambered over the edge and crawled on elbows and knees to safety. Orcan left him no time to catch his breath. "Let's get out of here, quick!" he shouted. They shot up and ran straight ahead down the sooty tunnel. Soon the torches petered out and were replaced by a faintly luminous green glow that came from the very rock. After a while, the tunnel divided into two. Richard turned to Melek. "Let's see what the Book of Prophecies says," he murmured. Melek read aloud.
"Cross the gap without mishap. An arrow saves the day. Find the side but chosen falls. Save him fast, then at last from blazing fires comes the glow. And then you know that air reveals the pod to feel, and evil steals the beasts to meet the blow."
As Melek read aloud, Richard started to frown. "Well, the tunnel splits here, so we must be at the point where the darkness is rent," he said. "I'll check the Pathfinder." "Down there," he said after a while, returning the instrument to Melek and pointing to the right-hand tunnel. As they advanced over sharp flints and pebbles, the trio noticed that the air bore a faint smell of burning. The tunnel opened into a deep, wide cavern. A narrow path zigzagged across to a monstrous, craggy wart that rose in the cave's centre from the dark, shadowy depths. "That must be Enlil's dungeon," Richard said in a low voice. The crater's sandy yellow sides were wrinkled by years of lava flow, and a faint ribbon of smoke rose from its centre. The volcano was still active. Nothing stood between the trio and total void as they picked their way between the crumbling edges of the path. Suddenly Orcan jabbed Richard in the ribs and tilted his head up. They had reached the entrance to Enlil's dungeon. A pair of thick, iron-studded doors was let into a vertical slab of lava. A long, heavy sword, set crosswise on massive iron supports, secured the doors shut. On either side, tethered to the rock by a thick chain, stood a huge, savage-looking dog. The dog's eyes stared blindly ahead, their pupils small black pinpoints at the centre of bright golden embers. The beast's heavy jaws were bared to display blade-sharp teeth, and beneath the dog's spiked collars bulged barrel-chested bodies. The animals were straining forwards, snarling and pawing the air with their claws. Orcan turned to Melek and Richard. "I'll keep them busy while you open the doors," he said, "but you'll have to be quick." Orcan slid his sword out of its scabbard, and the sharp blade whipped the air. The slavering dogs raged forwards, pulling the heavy chain so taut that Richard thought they were going to fly out of the heavy metal anchors. Just out of the dog's reach, Orcan flourished his weapon, and its tip glanced a dog's lip. The white foam became a shower of blood-coloured spittle. As Orcan ducked and dived in front of the raging dogs, Richard and Melek slipped under the stretched-out chains and started to push the heavy sword up. Summoning up every ounce of their strength, Richard and Melek strained and pushed. Hot pain shot through Richard's back and arms, but he arched against the door, and at last the sword swung up on a pivot from its ancient brackets. Richard and Melek pushed the massive doors ajar and stepped inside. Whatever lay ahead was cloaked in darkness. Richard turned to Melek. "Wait here," he said. "I'm going back to help Orcan." Darting under the clunking chain, he ran to Orcan. "I'll take over," he commanded. "Get inside, quick!" As Orcan ducked under the chain, Richard drew out Jarut's dagger and pulled the hood of his tunic over his head. Everything swam in front of his eyes, then his vision was normal again. For a moment, the two dogs were stunned into silence. Their foe had disappeared before their eyes, leaving a weapon floating in mid-air. The dagger whirled past the bemused beasts, and Richard crashed into Orcan just as he reached the door. The dogs howled in anger as the three made their way into the gloom of a tunnel, quite unlike the one they had fled through earlier. This was flanked by carved columns and carefully engineered beams arched across the ceiling. It was like being in a cathedral. As the three moved slowly down the tunnel, the air got warmer and warmer. At the same time, the tunnel itself became lower and narrower. After a while, howls and groaning drifted towards them. At first indistinct, then louder and clearer. The tunnel ended abruptly in an untidy pile of boulders. As they crept over the top, the three companions saw a gigantic cave. At the centre, a sulphurous, bubbling hole heaved and spat molten rock. Shuffling slowly along a narrow path that jagged and turned around the seething cauldron, surged a wailing chain of beasts. Creatures of all kinds hauled massive logs and tree trunks to feed the searing flames. Despite their obvious pain, the look in their eyes was one of hypnotized obedience. High above the lava cauldron sat two huge, menacing bats. Scalloped black wings spread threateningly at their sides. Slitted, bloodshot eyes surveyed the scene below with an intense concentration. In front of them, mounted on a tall, intricate stand made from tiny, interlocking bones, rested a small, purple object. "The pod!" Richard exclaimed in delight. Then he added in a whisper, "They must be Enlil and Erna."
"How on earth are we going to get close enough to get the pod?" Orcan asked. "It's right in front of them."
Richard felt the hood of Golan's tunic flutter at the back of his neck, and he turned around. The vague outline of the Guardian's face shimmered darkly on the lava walls. "Of course," he thought to himself. "Get ready to distract those two while I get the pod," Richard commanded, pointing to some rocks and boulders nearby. Then he pulled the hood of his tunic over his head. At that instant, Orcan and Melek took a step forward into the glowing light near the raging cauldron. Enlil and Erna saw the intruders immediately. In confused rage, they flapped their giant wings, ready to attack. Orcan and Melek seized some stones in either hand and started hurling a steady stream of projectiles at their menacing enemies. One of Orcan's missiles hit the tall stem of a thin chalk-white column. As it snapped, the column loosened a giant upside-down crown of stalactites that hung above Enlil and Erna, unleashing a storm of stone spears. A sharp stalactite caught in the chain that held an amulet around Enlil's neck, wrenching off the symbol of evil and hurling it into the bubble of lava. Then the volley of stone spears pierced the bat's vast wings and jabbed at their huge bodies. The evil pair tumbled, screaming, into the cauldron. In the background, Melek and Orcan saw the pod rise from its macabre stand.
He's got it,
Orcan murmured as the pod floated towards them, riding an invisible air current. "Let's go," Richard shouted, joining his companions under a hail of sharp stones. As they scrambled back towards the tunnel, there was an ear-searing screech, then silence. The trio ran on down the corridor without a backward glance. Then a raw, frightening sound filled the air. The beasts were crying out with one pained voice. The trio ran on desperately, followed by the rhythmic hammering of heavy footfalls. Turning back, they saw a flood of Enlil's slaves advancing towards them. Their eyes were glazed, their march unstoppable. Orcan and Richard drew their swords and looked at one another. Each saw his thoughts reflected in the other's eyes. This was the end, the last stand of good against overwhelming evil.